So, on this topic, where do we start? So, I guess one kind of natural starting point is Dr. Asante, who I've worked with, for so many years, and what a wonderful colleague and friend, and he's such a wonderful human being. And what he will say is that when he started making diagnoses, recognizing the problem of FASD in his practice in Terrace and Northern BC and the Yukon, he said, in the beginning, I really thought that if these children were in, loving and nurturing homes, that everything would go well, that they would turn out okay. But the more we began to really understand this underlying, brain dysfunction, and then as we realized the children are growing older and life is more complicated and there's so many more challenges for them, that it really becomes much harder. And obviously those early years are so very important. But we now end up with a certain number of youth, unfortunately, that end up in the justice system. Okay, so first of all, briefly, I just want to talk about some general principles that apply to people with FASD in the legal system. The first item is that people with disabilities, including a mental handicap or an intellectual disability, they're not excused for their behavior. And this is really important because I think sometimes, what people are thinking is that, well, if they have a disability, such as FASD, that means that they're going to get off, if they've done a crime. But that isn't correct, that they're not excused. But what it does mean that we need to understand the disability. So this is an example from Judge Cunliffe Barnett. I imagine he's familiar to many of you for his work on the bench in Williams Lake and in the north. And he says, regarding a place and the concept of general deterrence, we sometimes incarcerate people to deter others from doing the same crime. That's one of the principles of the legal system. But what he said was, he says, I believe it is simply obscene to suggest that a court can properly warn other potential offenders by inflicting a form of punishment upon a handicapped person who has indeed committed an offense for which some sanction must follow, but that is not justice, that is unthinking retribution. Okay, so that's the first concept. And then secondly, the disabilities and the capabilities must be considered. So even though now in the legal system there are many courts and judges who want to know that the person has a disability, such as FASD, one of our judges, Judge Carly Truman, has said, well, don't just tell me he has FASD, that tells me nothing. I need to know what his profile looks like because each individual is different, as we were hearing earlier today. So the disabilities and the capabilities need to both be considered. So this is a quote from Justice Barry Stewart from the Yukon Territorial Court. And it was in the case of a sexual assault. And he said there was no medical evidence of the sexual assault, nor was there expert evidence explaining the extent to which the mental handicaps of the complainant and other witnesses may have affected their testimony. This left a reasonable doubt given the conflicting evidence from other witnesses and the inherent inconsistencies in the complainant's evidence. So the idea is that when the court is hearing conflicting and contradictory statements, they don't know what to believe. But if there is an assessment that says, this is what the person's abilities and disabilities are, and this is how it affects his testimony, or likely affects his testimony, then the court can take that into consideration. And that's what they do. And then thirdly, FASD means brain damage. And we use different terms to talk about the different effects of the alcohol in the brain, but to realize that something has changed in terms of how the person is able to reason and think and anticipate consequences and so on. And again, this is Justice Stewart about a young adult, Mr. Sam, who again was convicted of a serious crime, a sexual assault. And he says, finally, I do recognize in imposing this jail sentence that I cannot assess this crime against the standards of a normal person. FAS has taken away from Mr. Sam the ability others have to act within the norms expected by society. So society has its expectations about how we need to behave, but to realize that that's something that has happened to this individual alters his ability to conform to those norms or to understand those norms. And the next one is they are entitled to equal access to the legal system and to fair treatment. And probably your first reaction is, well, of course, why not? Why wouldn't they get equal access? Why wouldn't they get fair treatment if they have FASD? But the reasons why include the disability itself. So for example, if the person has a language disability as part of the FASD and reasoning disabilities, and this person is supposed to be informing his lawyer of what he wants to do, plead guilty, plead not guilty, and one adult in the Lower Mainland, and you may remember reading about it, his lawyer finally quit because his client wanted to plead guilty to the most extensive charge because then he would go to federal prison and they were allowed to smoke there. So the judgment was so poor that the lawyer just said, I don't know how to work with this client. So their fair treatment might be jeopardized because of the disability, especially if we don't know what that disability is. And so other aspects of fair treatment include things like the programs that are available to a person who may be in jail. And so in one case, Victor Williams, who's part of our video series at the Asante Center, his advocate talks about the fact that in order to go to this program, and you go to the programs and then it may reduce your sentence, so you might be up for parole earlier. Well, he had to be able to read, and he couldn't read past the grade 2 level, so he couldn't take the program. Or in youth justice, there are behavioral levels, and so based on your behavior, you get more freedoms and you get to do more things. But if the person is FASD, they may never get past the first level. And it's because of the FASD and the difficulties associated with that, not because they're just being difficult or they're being oppositional. So you can see how their fair treatment may be jeopardized, and this is what we have to prevent. And I think this is one of my most important reasons for doing some of these, doing assessments on some of these legal cases, which is to try to ensure the fair treatment. I'm not trying to suggest this person is going to get off or get lesser sentences or anything like that, but I want him to get fair treatment. And fair does not mean the same. So in these cases, what's appropriate for a person who has a normally functioning brain and what's appropriate for the person who has a disability could be very different in terms of how we manage them. And they will return to our community. So with very few exceptions, an individual who has committed a crime, who has gone to jail, will come back to our community. And here's another statement, and this is by, let's see, this Barry Stewart, and he says, let me just find this one. If jail worsens emotional or mental problems, then incarceration should be avoided or shortened, and other remedies used that redress personal problems causing criminal behavior. No significant weight should be accorded to specific and general deterrence if the offender suffers from a significant mental disorder. So all of these ideas are trying to say that we need to take into consideration the disability of FASD, but in order for this to happen, we have to have the assessment. Otherwise, we don't know.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, in order to get to all that, that person would have to go through that lengthy that process of being assessed.
Well, if the court wants to know, does FASD play a role in this person's behavior and in whatever.
And if they haven't had a formal diagnosis and they're being slammed and slammed continuously in our small communities, can that courts hold up or ask for that stuff? And jump the queue, I guess.
Yeah, well, and sometimes they do. And this is sort of the difficult issue about getting the diagnosis. But I think what we're hoping will happen, especially as time goes on, is now that we have our clinics in all of our community, or accessible to all of our communities, then children will grow up having had the diagnosis.
So what if they don't, and they're already an adult, and they're already youth, and they're already on that, they're only, what, 19, is it?
Yeah, that's right.
19,
yeah.
So then after that, then they're screwed? What?
No,
like
no.
It's really, it feels hopeless for some of us that are adults that really are functioning at an 8-year-old.
Mm-hmm. So this is sort of this is the bigger discussion about diagnosis for adults, but we do those assessments.
For sure.
Yeah, and of course, there's the cost involved, and that comes about in
Of
different
course,
ways.
that's the trouble we run into, is getting those people in our communities, and they do not get the cause and effect, and we continuously get into trouble.
That's right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Within this assessment, would you be able to pinpoint the minimal effects of fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, or based on severity? Would it be just, I guess, correlated with their behaviors?
Well, we don't have time to really go through the whole diagnostic process to show you how it works, but there are certain criteria based on the assessment that allows us to feel relatively confident that yes, indeed, the person does have FASD. And certainly we miss people perhaps who have maybe milder effects, but we can't be making a diagnosis, if there isn't a lot, enough evidence. So you're right, we may be missing people, but you'll see a little bit more as we go on what the typical youth who does have FASD, how he presents in the legal system. And you'll see how then it becomes, in many cases, fairly straightforward because you see what the disabilities are. All right, so FASD means brain damage. It's a lifelong disability, and I think probably everyone in the room realizes this now. FASD alone is a protective factor. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, one of our probation officers said, well, if he only had FASD, he probably would be okay. But he doesn't. He has FASD and conduct disorder and some of the other things that go along with that. So I have a little bit of a disagreement with some of the things that Diane was talking about earlier. But in actual fact, we have the compounding effects. And not all individuals with FASD, of course, are ending up in trouble with the law. And why not? And probably a lot of it has to do with some of these other mental health disorders, which they may have had anyway because some of them have a genetic basis. They may not be caused or associated with the FASD. Because what you see, you have the FASD, and I guess what's overlaid on which is open to debate, but we have the genetics that they come with. We have the environment that they live with. So as you all know, children are born with different temperaments. And that temperament, as it interacts with the family and the environment, has a lot to say about how he turns out. And then you have FASD along with that, and then that creates additional challenges. And the important thing is that each person, each child or adult with FASD has his or her own learning and behavioral profile. People with FASD can function well in life with proper support. And that's what we're learning more and more about. When they get in trouble with the law, this is a particular challenge. All right, so I always start with this. And you can see it's the Ombudsman's report, November 1990. It's getting a little old, but I want you to listen to this story, see if you think things have changed. And you can see that the title of this is Public Services to Children, Youth, and Their Families in British Columbia, the Need for Integration. This idea of how you need to be integrating services, whether it's health, education, social services, justice, how we need to integrate services rather than having everybody do their own thing. So this report, there's a lot in this report, but a lot of it has to do with this boy, Joey, who in this picture is 17 years old. I guess I should have had you try to guess how old he is before I showed you his picture, but how old do you think he looks?
13, 14.
14, 13, 12, it could be anything, much younger than he looks now, but just a very cute young man. Well, he was one of the first youth to be diagnosed with FAS in British Columbia. And when he was born in BC Children's Hospital, his mother, who obviously had some significant problems, she abandoned him at birth, and so he went into a foster home. And he did have the advantage of being in one foster home, unlike many of the children that we see that tend to go into home after home after home. And he did quite well. And it's very interesting because going back in 1990, at that point he was already maybe 15 years old, something like that. So you go back from there, and we were able to look at his school records. And long before there were checklists of what is FAS like, the teachers were writing things like, oh, he never learns from consequences. Oh, he's so impulsive, and all the things that are on the checklist. But they didn't have the checklist. They were observing him. And in this foster home, he has this wonderful foster mom, And she taught him social skills, and she would have these political parties, and he would learn these certain things that he would say, and he would pass the hors d'oeuvres. And he did really quite well, obviously in special education classes in school. But then what happened is, well, he became a teenager, number one. But more importantly, at that point, his foster mom became ill, and she was no longer able to look after him. So then he started going to other foster care. And when he was in high school, he began leaving the school grounds at noon and going to the mall and anything. Things went from bad to worse. His behavior became out of control. So eventually, they sent him to a group home, which is in Chase, BC. So he's at this place, and there's another kid there who we understand also has FAS, but we haven't studied him as much. And so poor Joey, he's so homesick. He wants to come back to Vancouver. So the other kid says to him, well, if you burn the place down, they'll have to send you back to Vancouver. So he tried to burn the place down. And there were several apparent unsuccessful attempts at burning the place down. And part of the Ombudsman's report are things like, well, where was the supervision, and why were there cans of gasoline lying around, and all sorts of things that went wrong in his particular case. But very, very sadly, he was successful. So he pushed a couch against an exit door so that people wouldn't be able to stop him from leaving, and the fire was set, and very tragically, a boy was killed in this fire. So now, what to do about Joey? So the question was, at that point, should he be raised to adult court? And so the psychiatrist who examined him said, he's a very dangerous guy. And on the basis of him saying things like, well, Joey comes and he's interviewed, and Joey says, well, you know all those dumpsters where they had those fires in Vancouver? Well, I started those. And then he said, and I'm also a drug runner, and I used to deliver that black stuff, that heroin, that black stuff. And so all of these things, none of it was true, none of it was ever proven. But he had this bravado. And so the psychiatrist said, well, if he has 3 years in juvenile detention, that's not going to be enough to rehabilitate him. Well, of course not. He has FAS, he's got a significant mental handicap. Extra time in jail isn't going to make any difference. So he was convicted of manslaughter, and they did send him to an adult prison. So here you have a boy younger than this, who looks even much younger, in a prison with, the adult prison population. And so there were petitions right away to get him sent back to juvenile because he was being abused and so on. Well, eventually it was time for him to be released, and that was when I became involved with Dr. Christine Locke. And one of the things we did was to go out to the adult prison just to find out more about what his situation was like there. And this is what has stuck in my mind all of these years, and this is why I keep telling this story, which is that one of the staff people out there said, well, I don't think that Joey ever really understood that he caused the death of that boy because he never saw the body. And so this is the concrete thinking of someone who has FAS. He didn't understand because he wasn't trying to kill anybody. He didn't want to kill anybody, and so he just didn't understand. Well, now he's not 17. Now he's not quite as cute. And so our recommendation was that he needed to be in a well-supervised adult-type foster home with things to do during the day. Well, he was put in a home, but nothing to do during the day. And what began happening was he began stealing frozen steaks and giving them to people or something like that. And so the foster parents said, well, when we leave at 8 o'clock in the morning, you have to leave too, and we get back at 5, you can come back at 5. But there was nothing for him to do during the day except to wander around on Granville Street with other youth similar to himself. So one of the next things that happened was he's with these youth and so vulnerable, and one of these other guys says, well, I really like one of those NHL jackets. And Joey said, oh, I know where I can get one of those. They have those at Zeller's. And I'll tell you what, I'll only charge you the number on the ticket. Well, so he shoplifts the jacket and gets picked up immediately. And of course he says, oh, I'm getting this for my friend who's waiting outside. Well, of course there's no friend waiting outside. And well, maybe my friend's at the SkyTrain. Well, of course, no friends at the SkyTrain either. So time and time again, then he was the one that took the blame. So this is part of the thing about the fair treatment, which is he's so vulnerable, so wanting to please, and he's the one that's left to take the blame. And so over the years, I've heard different things about Joy in audiences like this. Anybody here know Joy? No, not here. At one point, someone said to me, oh, I know, he's living out in the valley, he's living with a girlfriend, things are going pretty well. Another time, someone said to me, well, actually, oh, I knew him when he was in school, and told me some more things. And someone else said at a different point, well, I think he's been in jail a couple of times since. So, it's been a while, I don't know where Joey is. But it started out well for Joy because of the support and the supervision, and then it just fell apart. So I noticed this morning that everybody had seen the picture of the brain, so maybe everybody's already seen the secondary disability, so I'll do this pretty quick. But think about Joy, joblessness. Who's going to give him a job? He doesn't know how to look for a job. He doesn't have the social skills anymore, and you can see, he's just, who's going to hire him? Homelessness, trouble with the law in his case, early school dropout, unplanned pregnancies, well, that didn't apply to him, but very common. Parenting problems often for people with FAS who do have children, and mental health concerns. And I'm going to focus quite a bit on the mental health concerns, our own alcohol and drug issues, getting involved in the sex trade, both the males and the females. Now HIV risk, of course, very high, premature death. So again, you've probably seen the same slide, but the important point is looking at the IQ, these secondary disabilities, because we always think, well, if you're smarter, you should be able to avoid all of these problems. Okay, so this first column is the mental health concerns, and this dotty column here, these are the individuals whose IQ are below 70. So this is the range that we consider an intellectual disability. It's the bottom 3 in 100 people. This next group here, the stripy group there, are in what we call sort of the borderline low average range. But once we get to the black line here, those are people that are really, at least on these measures, are in the average range. So, but look at this, over 90% with mental health problems. And we weren't paying attention to that before. So IQ doesn't protect you against mental health problems, disrupted school experiences, higher IQ, more likely you're going to be kicked out, trouble with the law, it's worse if you have a higher IQ, confinement meaning it could be in jail or some other custodial setting. Inappropriate sexual behavior is a little bit higher for those with the lower IQ, alcohol and drug abuse. And then, this is of course what we have to be concerned about is dependent living. If you're in that really low range, 100% are going to need help with their day-to-day living. But how can it be that you have people with this higher IQ, average IQ, like a lot of us, and almost 80%, they can't live on their own without things going wrong, whether they can't budget their money, they have an apartment, but they invite people in who trash the place and they get kicked out. All of these things, can't take their medications, all of these things. High IQ, I don't get it. I'm a psychologist and I still don't quite get it, how they can be bright enough in so many ways, but day-to-day living, they cannot. Problems with employment, again, they seem smart enough and they can get the jobs, but they can't keep the jobs. Okay, so the trouble with the law then, you can see that it's the higher IQ. So why? Well, we don't know, but if you have a lower IQ, maybe it's more obvious and they're more protected. But in Ann Streiskov's study, this group whose IQs were this 80 to 90, low average to average, had the greatest risk of having trouble with the law. And then the terms FAS and FA are used because that's Ann Streiskov's, that's an older study. So the FAE are the ones that we now call ARND. For the most part, are partial FAS. But again, you can look at these age ranges. The young children are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and then into those school years. But then as you get into those transition years and the adult years, then you start seeing depression and hallucinations, so some serious mental health problems. But you see, even here with this young age group, we're seeing these problems. And I think in general in psychology, people are recognizing that we have to be looking at mental health problems at a much younger age. And I know this is something through my work, on the team here with Dr. Moisey that he's really concerned about that. And then the serious problems, suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, you see, and that increases as people get older. So really serious problems that we need to be addressing earlier. The inappropriate sexual behavior, I read a couple of examples, those court examples that involve sexual assaults. And again, this probably is already known to you that it's more likely, and in this case with this group, doubled for those who themselves have experienced sexual abuse. And this actually, I think this was Chris Locke that actually said this, the females are more likely to be sent for therapy and the boys go to jail. Okay, so this word comorbid, does that bother you? It's a psychiatric and medical term, which means it's several things associated. And this list is pretty much the same list that we saw this morning with Diane Alban. So there's all these other things, and I think what she was saying, and I definitely say as well, they're not wrong diagnoses, but they may be incomplete diagnoses if you don't also have the option or the ability to make the FASD assessment. And it makes sense because psychiatrists aren't trained usually to make an FASD assessment. And we make it as a multidisciplinary team. And they make their assessments solo in their offices. So that's part of the explanation. So you can see a lot of these problems. I'm going to come back to some of them. I'm particularly interested in autism because we're seeing both FASD and autism together quite often. And so there's some suggestion that in some cases, obviously not all or even the majority, that the alcohol exposure may be contributing or causing those autism symptoms. But we know also autism has a genetic link, they're still trying to figure this out. Here's the rest of the list, and this list is courtesy of Jake Locke, who's a psychiatrist in Vancouver. So it is important to have these psychiatric evaluations to really piece it all out, to see what are we dealing with here. We have to manage all of these problems. And then this is where we begin seeing, well, what are the families? And this was Susan Astley's study, and it's the 80 birth mothers of children with FAS. And it's looking at the percentage of them that have serious mental health problems of their own. So you can see the list, and you can examine it more carefully on your handout later, I guess. You can see that post-traumatic stress is a huge one. And then, of course, alcohol abuse. But some of them, the alcohol abuse occurred, later in life. But importantly, it's multiple mental health problems. You can see that nearly half had 2 to 4 of those disorders. So it isn't just one thing. So these are very complex families. And so when we're doing the assessments, we have to look at the whole family. And I'm going to come back to more of that later. And again, these are these same moms. Their levels of being abused, whether it's during their lifetime or as children, is extremely high. But we have to know that, we have to appreciate that and consider that. And half of them had FAS themselves. Okay, so the question is it secondary? So I agree with what Diane Mulvin was saying around how your circumstances, your frustration can lead to some of these symptoms. But this is Joanne Weinberg's research, and this is with animal research where you can control everything. And so what her research shows is that the alcohol exposure itself increases the risk for mental health disorders because it disrupts the stress hormones. And so it increases the vulnerability to disorders such as anxiety and depression, which also have a genetic link as well. So we have the genetic vulnerability, we have the alcohol exposure, and then we have the adverse life experiences. So you can see it's so complex to try to piece it apart. So is it a secondary disability? Well, sometimes, but it may very well be a primary disability. So some people are suggesting that when you see multiple mental health problems in an individual, you really should start asking the question, is FASD part of it as well? All right, so what do we know about FASD in the criminal justice system? So over the years, now going back, at least to 1996, we become aware there seem to be a large number of youth and adults in contact with the law. And this is before we had a lot of assessment. So why is that? So we think that these neurological impairments that are part of FASD increase susceptibility It doesn't make it happen in all cases, but increases the susceptibility to criminal behavior and victimization. So for most of today, I'm going to be speaking of the case where the youth is the perpetrator, but let's not forget the victims as well, who may have FASD. Then also their social environments may increase the probability of trouble with the law. And then we really don't know how many people in trouble with the law have FASD, because probably a lot of them have not been diagnosed, and that of course is the frustration that you raised. And so this was a study that I did with Diane Fast and Christine Locke, which was way back in 1997, but there really hasn't been another study with youth like this. So these were youth that went to youth court services for their psychiatric assessments because someone felt there was something else different about them. So for a period of a year, there were 287 youth, and that we found 23.3% then were given on our assessment diagnosis of FASD. And at that time, it was FAS, FAE, because that was before we had the current guidelines. But importantly, only 3 had full FAS, so the rest had more of the invisible disability. Only 3 had had a prior FASD diagnosis, and it wasn't those 3. One of them, I guess, was. All right, so again, we're trying to, in order to do preventative work, we have to understand the problem. So this again is an older study. It doesn't have to do with FASD, but it's what are the predisposing factors that seem to link with kids getting into trouble with the law. So the first one is early onset conduct problems. So we do see some children in the preschool years that have conduct problems. Now with younger children, we don't call it conduct disorder, we call it oppositional defiant disorder. But you see these problems early on, like where did these come from? ADHD, so you're impulsive, you do things without thinking, somewhat lower intelligence, the problems of parental alcoholism, but this, they didn't connect it to FASD. The parents themselves who have criminal histories, and they call it deficient parenting, which is, probably not enough supervision of the youth and so on. And so here we have these comorbid disorders. So you do this conduct disorder, substance use disorder, and ADHD. Those are the big 3, both for the youth with FASD, and in that study we had matched controls, also going through youth forensic services. So that applied to everybody. And I would say that the big one here is substance use disorder. So did anybody watch the news last night after your evening here on the Global or here the CBC? Well, very timely, because a young adult was in court, and the situation was that he had assaulted a bus driver in Vancouver, causing brain damage to the bus driver. And so what they said of him was he has FAS, and what was the other thing I was going to say? And his Aboriginal status.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are 2 factors to take into consideration. So they didn't do the sentencing. So FAS and the Aboriginal status. In the early report that I heard, they also talked about the fact that at the time of the offense, he was under the influence of alcohol and drugs. So this is where this huge thing comes in, where if the person isn't involved with alcohol and drugs, would they end up doing these things? So I'm concerned because the report sounds like here we have this person with FAS and he's badly assaulted a bus driver. So they make that connection. But I think really the more important connection is the alcohol and the assault. Because, all bets are off when they're under the influence. Okay, so our question is, so do those who are alcohol exposed, do they differ from other youth who get in trouble with the law? We think they do, but do they? So in this particular study, it said they did not differ on measures of the variety of acts or the frequency of their delinquent behavior. But what was associated was higher adolescent life stress, higher self-reported drug use, and lower parental supervision. So that kind of is supported by some of the things that I already said. So that was what was associated with more delinquent acts. All right, well, what about the adults? So again, this is probably, well known to you. If you don't know the figures, you probably have a sense of this. So these are adult offenders. 80% have alcohol and drug problems. Impulsivity and poor problem solving characterize these inmates. approximately half were under the influence of alcohol and drugs at the time of the offense, just like this young man, and the offense may also be committed to support the addiction. Okay, so I need more alcohol, I need more drugs, so I commit this particular crime. So these are the figures for the Correction Service of Canada. So the best adult study we have, so we have the youth study that I just reported on, and this is by Chudley and McPherson at Stony Mountain Institution. And so this is what they found. So compared to adult offenders with an FASD diagnosis, we have these offenders who have central nervous system deficits. They have brain deficits. Well, what are these deficits? Well, what happens to a lot of these young men as they grow older? They get into car accidents. They get into fights. They get really beat up. And you even will ask some of these young men, have you ever had a head injury? Well, no, I've never had a head injury. Well, did you ever get knocked out? Oh yeah, lots of times. They don't even call it a head injury. So we have these offenders and that had these deficits that were not alcohol related. But that group were more likely to have moderate rather than significant deficits. And importantly, they did not evidence the poor adaptive behavior of those with FASD. So that seems to be the distinguishing factor. And those with FASD had significant problems with being unaware of consequences, poor memory, poor social functioning. So we're beginning to get a little bit of an idea of what those differences really are. But what happens to the person with FAS as he grows older? Well, he's in fights, he's in motor vehicle accidents. He gets beat up on the head with a crowbar. So he's got multiple head injuries, and then they go into these extreme sports where they deliberately cause head injuries. All right, so these are some of the things that we've learned about people with FASD versus typical or normal, whatever. Responding to social cues. So we hope that as most people grow up, they understand social cues. Not everybody does, but in general they do. So oftentimes the person with FASD comes across as non-compliant or stubborn. Well, that can mean a couple of things. When a person is non-compliant, sometimes it really just means, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing, because whatever you told me was so complicated, I don't understand it, so of course I can't do it. So it can be non-compliant, stubborn that way. But stubborn can also mean being very rigid in your thinking. I can't do it another way, I have to do it this way. And rigidity is characteristic of people with brain injury from other causes. So we're talking about the same brain being injured by alcohol or being injured by other causes. So we often hear about people who have been seriously injured in a motor vehicle accident, that they become very rigid in their thinking. Misinterpreting cues. So these are the youth where someone just brushes by them and they think it's a major assault. And don't look at me that way. So they misinterpret those social cues, usually to an extreme. And particularly the youth or young adults, they bug and they bug and they bug and they go too far because they don't recognize the cue that someone is really getting irritated with them. So that then, the other part about this is that they always pick on the biggest guy to bug and go too far, like no judgment. Do not appreciate their effect on others, this perspective taking. And so one of my best examples of this was a young man, and he lived in a small community. He, along with actually younger kids, decided to hold up the corner convenience store. So it's a small community, everybody knows everybody else. So he goes in, and they're stealing cigarettes and candy bars. But he has a knife, and he holds the knife to the young woman's neck, the clerk. And she's terrified, of course. Well, anyway, so he gets arrested, and part of it was, well, I shouldn't have been arrested because the other guys ratted on me and that wasn't fair. But anyway, so people over and over again, his lawyer and everybody else kept saying to him, he didn't understand why he was in such trouble. Well, it was because that lady thought you were going to kill her. And he says, I never was going to kill her. I wasn't going to hurt her. Well, she doesn't know that. Well, I wasn't going to hurt her. I just don't understand why she's so upset. Okay, that's being unable to appreciate the effect of their behavior on others. And then egocentric, it's never their fault. So this egocentrism is, again, it's being only able to see things from your own perspective. And that's mental immaturity. We see that with younger children as well. They don't know what anybody else is thinking, they only know what they're thinking, or they think that you know what they're thinking. So, but it's egocentric, it's never their fault, it's always someone. Even though you let them into the house and showed them where your mother keeps her jewelry and they stole it, it's not my fault, they're the ones that stole the jewelry. Okay, showing a range of emotions, and people with FASD also of course show a range of emotions, but oftentimes it seems that they over or underreact. Overreact, a simple thing. You're supposed to deliver the newspapers and it's raining. And then, the kid punches his fist through the window. Okay, overreacts or underreacts. Everybody is really sad about something that happened. A grandparent died, and he just doesn't seem to show the reaction. So we don't know if it's that he doesn't feel the reaction, but he doesn't show the reaction. And so a lot of our interactions with people, it's because it's interactive. We see how they feel, and there's this back and forth. So they may show this flat affect, particularly as they grow older. They may be depressed, but oftentimes it's this flat affect, like they're not showing that they're excited or they're happy, or lack of eye contact. And that was actually mentioned in the CBC report yesterday. They actually said that this young person, he looked the judge straight in the eye, and he looked the victim straight in the eye, and he said, and he had read a prepared statement about how sorry he really was. And I thought to myself, okay, well, he's been to my lecture, because when we get down to the bottom of the list here, one of the things I say to the youth is, did your lawyer tell you how you should act in court? No. Well, sometimes the lawyers do and sometimes they don't. But one of the key things is look at the person, because they can be, inappropriate response to the situation, especially if it's youth court. Their friends are all in the back, and it's just kind of a big party going on. But you're supposed to look serious about this. You're supposed to show remorse. Act like you show remorse. And sometimes they're just kind of unresponsive, like no initiative. So you set up programs for them, and then they don't go. All you have to do is go to that office and sign up, and you're in. And they can't quite do it. And then as a caregiver or a support person, you feel like, why do I keep doing this for you? Because you don't follow through. But to realize that it takes this extra push and some help because they sometimes don't have the initiative. They just don't know how to go about doing it. So when you look at all of those characteristics, there was a study done, and I think it was on youth, a long time ago. It didn't have to do with FAS, but it was around the fact that in any particular case, a judge may have a range of options in terms of consequences or sentences. And so there's something called the least punitive fit. So if you're of middle class and you speak well and you make eye contact and you show remorse, you're going to get a lighter sentence than if you come across as, I'm not caring what's going on here and this sort of thing. In which case, it's always as though, well, all right, in order to make a point here, it has to be a harsher sentence. Like harsher is going to make a dent, somehow. So all of these things can be important for the youth. First of all, how you interact with them and when he goes to court. So this wasn't necessarily about FAS, but this goes back when people are trying to figure out what's going on with people with learning disabilities getting into trouble with the law. So all you have to do is take this certain types of learning disabilities and put in FAS, general impulsiveness, poor ability to learn from experience, poor reception of social cues, and then, this is what I think is an important one, decreased effectiveness of the usual social sanctions and rewards. Okay, well, what does that mean? I think a lot of what we do, our behavior as adults, is because of social sanctions. Like if you were caught driving under the influence, you don't want your name in the paper. These kids thrive on their name in the paper. So you hear time and time again, some CEO who, some fraud going on, and he's about to be sentenced for his white-collar crime. And the lawyer will say, well, Your Honor, he just needs, probation because he's suffered enough. His reputation is ruined, his family is ruined. It's the social sanctions. But that's a very abstract concept that I think doesn't apply so much to youth with FASD. And it may go way back to their lack of attachment. Because I think, how do we learn how to behave socially? What are social expectations? It's because we're pleasing our caregiver. And that eventually we do it because, we feel that that's important. But it starts out by pleasing the caregiver because of that attachment. So I think that might have something to do with it. And I remember this one lawyer that was talking to his client about, why do you keep stealing these cars over and over again? And the youth said, oh, well, because that's what I do. And, the lawyer goes to court. That's what he does. I teach at UBC. That's what I do. Well, he steals cars. That's what he does. And so it increases the susceptibility, but doesn't guarantee that that's what's going to happen. So how do they differ? Probably their brain deficits, mental health issues, environmental factors make them more susceptible. And they present as more competent than they actually are due to some higher levels of functioning, like shown in the IQ test. And the brain deficits may be overlooked when the individual presents with a mental illness. And this was something that Diane Fast and I wrote an article recently, and this is this idea of the brain damage. So, offenders who have experienced a traumatic brain injury, so that's like what I was mentioning before, motor vehicle accident, bang on the head, fight. They once had a normally functioning brain. And after the traumatic event, there is possibility of recovering to a degree. Offenders with brain injury due to prenatal alcohol exposure never had a fully functioning brain, and they have fewer mental reserves to draw on. So we feel that when you have that compounding effect, it's just like the boxers who get knocked out time and time again, and eventually they end up with, Alzheimer's and dementia. So you start out with a brain that's already compromised and vulnerable, and then you add on some of these other things. It's going to make it worse. So some of these youth that want to get into these extreme sports, and no, we have to protect your brain. So these are the disabilities that may jeopardize our fair treatment. So ALARM is an acronym, and this is a little bit about understanding the brain. So Diane and I made this up for the book, FAS in the Criminal Justice System. And it's based on the brain domains of an FASD assessment. So we don't have enough time to go really through all of these areas that we go through for the assessment, how the brain works. But we use this acronym to capture the main ones. ALARM, A, adaptive behavior, so you already know now that's going to be the key one. Language, attention, reasoning, and memory. Okay, so here's the broad definition of adaptive behavior. Behavior that is effective in meeting the natural and social demands of one's environment. Okay, well, I can agree with that. The degree to which individuals are able to function and maintain themselves independently, that's the key one that was on that chart, and the degree to which they meet satisfactorily the culturally imposed demands of personal and social responsibility. So this is what society demands of you. And so these are some of the adaptive skills that seem to be problematic for someone with FASD. The social interactions are immature and easily led. They have trouble with basic day-to-day living skills like cooking and budgeting. They have poor self-confidence. They have difficulty with transition times. There's that stubborn about participating in certain tasks that they have to do. Sometimes they just can't stop behaviors. They get upset by changes in the routine. You said we were going to do this. No, the roads are too icy, we can't go, but you promised, you said. No sense of danger. You don't anticipate, you heard the example this morning, physical risk taker, unaware of the danger in social situations, Facebook and so on. This perspective taking. And this is an important one. It's low tolerance to the normal stresses of day-to-day living. And this is something that we had observed, like the simple things that bounce off our backs, we can handle, they can't handle. But now we know from the research of Joanne Weinberg that probably there's a reason for that, and it has to do with the alcohol exposure. Did you want to answer a question?
I do.
Okay, sorry, I was ignoring
I'm
it.
going to give the head just a little bit. What I really want to know is, what does the legal system have in place to help his youth that get in trouble? What is in place? What is in place for them? I know all this stuff. My students have all that. What I want to know is, what's going to help them in the legal system when they get into trouble?
Okay, well, there's a little bit of that in terms of some of the supports that we have been able to try to use for the youth who have gone through our program of assessments. what is there? Well, part of it really is, it is that understanding. So, for example, you know, if the person has this mental disability, you don't put them in jail with other offenders that are gonna take advantage of him. Okay, so that's one of the things, so he doesn't come out worse than when he went in. A huge part of it is the supervision, to realize, well, they can't live independently. So we have to put them in, if possible, into a living situation where a lot of them, whether it's youth or young adults, some of them have been able to be placed in a semi-independent living situation, so they have their space in a suite, basement suite, with adults that provide supervision and management of money and things like that. So a lot of it comes down to what Sterling Claren calls that external brain, and the person has to be willing to accept that help, which is a bit problematic. But you know, something, you know, and that's such a good question, and maybe we can try to come back to that. I hope we'll have a little bit of time at the end, because maybe there'll be people here who have some ideas on that. Okay, so anyway, this was a young woman who was in youth detention, and it was something that I did an assessment on, but it captures FASD. Again, she's quite old now. She said, "I'm having the best time of my life in YDC," and that was youth detention. "You are not going to try and help me because I don't have a drug and alcohol problem. The only problems I had started at home. I would just like to clear this for the record. You're not my real parents, and I'm not your real daughter, okay? I'm never coming back, never. I hate you both, and you can rot in hell for all I care. Love, happy face, please write back." So, when there's a bit of a disconnect, then you have to think, okay, she's not reasoning the way others would. And what happened to her since? I haven't heard about her for years and years now, but I did find out a few years later, she amazingly got a job as a teller in a bank. And her mom said to me, she said when her daughter comes home, she said, "Well, you know, Mom, I wouldn't steal anything because they have all of those cameras there." But I don't know how she lasted because, you know, her math skills weren't that good, and you have to have a bit of math.
Yeah, but it's also very repetitious work as a teller.
Well, part of it is, I mean, there's some judgment involved, but you're right.
For sure, and
Yeah.
it's the same,
Yeah.
and that's how they can work.
So I think she was okay for a while. And she did have higher abilities. And you know, and this other thing too, this is a youth, she was in youth detention at the time, and one of the things, the hope that we have, and we see it anecdotally, I don't know that we have research, is that if you can protect them long enough into their late 20s, particularly, things they begin to settle down a little bit. If you can protect them that long so they don't become entrenched in the system, then there is some maturity that seems to happen. If you can get them past that point, and it certainly isn't everybody, but we've certainly heard some good examples of that happening. Okay, so this is the language, and this is important, the language disabilities with FASD. So in this case, it says every person giving testimony in court of whatever age is an individual whose credibility and evidence must be assessed by reference to criteria appropriate to his or her mental development, understanding, and ability to communicate. So again, this is why we need the assessment, so that we know that when the person isn't responding appropriately in court, it isn't that he's lying or trying to be difficult, it may be because he has this language impairment. This was Judge Barry Stewart. I love the way judges write. "The tragedy of their vulnerability is heightened by their limited access to protection from the justice system. Mentally disabled victims do not fare well in our verbally based adversarial processes that demands mental agility, a good memory, quick responses, and to facilitate to readily employ a rich vocabulary to accurately describe or slightly obfuscate truth." In other words, if you ever had to go to court, if I go to court and they say to me, "Is it not true that you did not try not to do something?" I don't even know what that means. Okay, and you heard some of this already today, slow to process language. They just don't think fast enough, so someone else is going to take advantage of them because they are thinking faster. They don't understand the language. They're concrete and literal. And a good example of this was a boy who accosted somebody on the street and demanded their cell phone from them. And he kept insisting that I didn't steal it. He gave it to me. And that again is that concrete and literal thinking. And he's not just trying to, get away with something. This is truly what he believes. Acquiescence means that when you're questioned, could be by the police, could be in court, acquiescence means you agree with whatever they tell you. Because it's so complicated, and particularly leading questions. Well, you first did this, yeah, and then you went to the bar, yeah, and then you went back to the house, yeah, and then you stole a VCR, oh, yeah, I guess I did. Or shifting in response to negative feedback, you say to them, you know something? It couldn't possibly have happened that way. Oh, guess it didn't. So very much influenced and vulnerable because they don't have the language skills to understand the questions and respond to the best of their ability. Okay, so we already know from the earlier slide about 60% of children in supervised youth have attention problems, but it's the impulsivity. A lot of times the kids will say, well, I knew I shouldn't do it, but I just couldn't stop myself. And one example was a kid that was doing community hours, and he was cleaning up somebody's backyard. The supervisor of the kid goes to have a smoke, and the kid breaks into the house. And he said, I knew I shouldn't have done it, but I couldn't help myself. So that's of interest. Okay, reasoning, connecting cause and effect, and it's the seeming inability to hypothesize a chain of events. That you didn't get caught because you stole, the item from the store. I got caught because I was late for school. But where did it really start? It started when I stole the item from the store. And then I walked to school and I did something on the way. And then I was late for class and the teacher kicked me out in the hall. And then I went to the principal's office and he said, okay, detention. Well, that's what the problem is. The principal gave me detention. Well, no, not really. It started way back in the beginning. Linking behavior and consequences. Well, I had a teacher in one of my summer classes, and I was talking about FAS, and I said something about learning from consequences. She says, oh, have they discovered that they learn from consequences? And I said, well, yes, what else is there? And I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, this child in my class stabbed another student in the leg with scissors. I said, well, what did you do about it? She says, well, nothing, because they don't learn from consequences. Well, they do learn from consequences, but sometimes they learn from the exception rather than the rule, for one thing, or they don't generalize well. Okay, well, I have to tell you this story about not generalizing, because it happened in Hazelton. So this is a few years ago now. I don't know if any of you came to a nice FASD conference that was put on in Hazelton. And so myself and Dr. Asante and Audrey from our center and her son JD came and we did some presentations. Well, JD, he was in a pretty good space in his life at that point, and he is quite articulate, and he gave a really nice presentation. Now, what happened on that trip? A lot of things happened on that trip, but the one thing that happened was the first evening, and now, I don't know where we were, but it was, I don't know if it was a First Nations longhouse or Friendship Center or something. I'm just not sure where it was, but we were there to do just an information session in the evening. So we're in this big room, and Audrey spoke for a while, and I'm speaking for a while. And as I'm speaking, I'm smelling cedar smoke. And I'm thinking, oh, they're smoking salmon. Oh, that smells so good. Well, anyway, just go on. And then later we find out what had happened was JD had gone outside. And he was smoking a cigarette, and he tossed it in the grass, and it started burning the side of the building. So it was actually burning the cedar shakes on the building. And so there was a woman who happened to come out, and she was able to stop. Well, and then he left, I guess. He came back inside. But instead of just putting out the fire, she gauged the extent of the fire, and she brought him out so he could see in a concrete way that his cigarette had caused this fire. Oh, and he's mortified. Okay, well, that was in the evening. The very next morning, we're at the motel, and we come out in front of the motel, and we're getting ready to get in the car, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he tosses it into these dry bushes. It's, what are you thinking? Didn't you learn anything? Well, guess not. He didn't generalize anyway. Okay, easily led and victimized are sometimes the consequences. Okay, this is abstract reasoning. So this is true from one of the tests that we administer. A test has a bunch of pictures on a page, and it's 20 questions. So I say, I've selected one of these pictures. You ask me yes and no questions to guess what it is. Okay, so he says, is it an animal? I say no. Is it black? Yes. So then his next question is it the cow? I already said it wasn't an animal, so I say no again. Well, does it fly? Yes. Oh, is it the refrigerator? So there's no connection from one answer and question to the other. You're supposed to be building up your information, but it's like every one is a brand new one. Okay, and these are reasons for some of the crimes. 2 youths are caught riding in a stolen motorboat. One said, it's not stealing because we didn't take it out of the water. Okay, this next one happens a lot. I'm being caught stealing a car parked outside the police station. Well, you shouldn't have left it there. Like, it's never my fault, right? Here's a good example. Okay, and this one is courtesy of Jan Lucky, who probably many of you know. Her poor son stole some saddles from a rancher. He was caught because he was trying to sell them back to him. So Jan says to him, why would you do this? I knew he needed them. And then finally, this youth was visiting a friend across town and late for curfew, so he stole a car to get home on time. So it's just the reasoning, and all you do is just shake your head because, well, that's fine. And then this is courtesy of Dan Dubovsky. So his son needed money, and so he wrote up a bunch of these flyers. And this one says, bring $50,000. Some of them said, bring $50 or $500. He didn't understand place value that well. It says, to a red table on Proctor Street. And put the briefcase under the table. Do not stick a homing device in the case. He's been watching too much television. Make sure the money is real, unmarked, he knows that much, and do not go anywhere near that table until the next day. If you don't do exactly what I say, you know the deal. And once again, good luck and happy face. And sometimes you've read about, different robberies where, again, they've presented a note and signed the note, or presented the note, and again, it's happy face. Turn over all the money, happy face. Okay, now, memory. So we're getting through the alarms. So we went through A, L, A, R, we're on memory. And this is Barry Stewart. In a couple of cases, I have conducted trials where the accused, the victim, and the witnesses all suffer from FAS. And it's very difficult to get an understanding of what happened in the actual case. Your first impression is to think everybody is lying here, nobody is telling the truth. And then you begin to appreciate, no, they are trying their best, but because of the brain damage that they have suffered as a result of FAS or FAE, they're doing the best they can. And in the same interview, this was on the Fifth Estate quite a number of years ago, and in that same one, he said, we need to be taking the money out of the justice system and putting it into services for families in order for us to be successful. So we don't have this revolving door. So with memory then, what is the problem with memory? Because we all have things we can remember. Oh, I can remember hockey statistics and so on. And I think a concept of memory is that, I used to think anyway, that if something is important enough, you'll be able to remember it. If it's so important, you're not going to forget it. And then my concept totally changed when I had a friend who was in a motorcycle accident and suffered a bit of a brain injury, or just bump on the head anyway. And after this accident, he was supposed to go down to the police station and fill out the paperwork. And he was supposed to go at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on this certain day. Well, in the morning, he called me up and he said, well, what are you doing today? What are you doing? I'm writing reports as usual. And do you have time for lunch? I said, well, something, we could have lunch, but you have that appointment in the afternoon, and I don't know if there's time. He says, well, what appointment? Well, didn't you tell me you had to go to the police station? Oh, yeah, right. Oh, thanks for reminding me. Okay. Well, then a couple of more hours go by. Now it's noon, and he called me and said, well, do you have time for lunch? And I said, well, I think maybe you should get ready to go to your appointment. Oh, I forgot all about it. Okay. So then, later in the afternoon, I called him and I said, well, how did it go? At the police department. He says, what police department? So all of that had happened. It was so important to him, but he couldn't remember it. So, sometimes there is some selective remembering. Oh, sorry, Mom, I didn't remember to do this. But there are memory deficits. So memory involves registering the information to start with and then retrieving it when you need it. There's memory deficits in time. And this is the one that's so critical for the legal system because it's always, when did something happen? And they might say it happened a day ago, and it really was a month ago. Or they'll say, oh yeah, it was just a few days ago, it was a year ago. So the sense of time is so bad. And so you have to attach it to something. Well, did this happen before or after the baby was born, for example? Oh, okay, it happened after. So sometimes you can kind of work it that way. But sequencing, telling the story in the order that it happened. Okay, well, what happened that night? And the story's all over the place. not in sequence. So that's a very specific kind of deficit that you have to be alerted to when you're interviewing someone or working with someone. And confabulation refers to the idea that if you have a poor memory and you're asked to retell something, you do the best you can. And it isn't really a conscious thing, but you piece together information from a lot of different sources. And so it provides a coherent story, but it never really happened that way. And the person is doing the best he can, but it's not correct. And so the more times the person is interviewed, the more opportunity there is to introduce new information. Because the person who's a slow processor, and you ask him, well, what happened? And you're waiting, and our tolerance for silence is very short. You just wait. And then you say, well, did it happen this way or did it happen that way? Oh, well, it happened that way. And now that gets incorporated into his story, even though it may never even happened that way. But he couldn't think of what really did happen, and it was suggested to him. And then finally, false confession. So this was a case of Brian Tate. A false confession put him behind bars for 11 months for a double murder he could not have committed. He at first vehemently denied any involvement, but finally broke down and repeated a story police read to him. From that point on, his confession went wildly astray from the known facts. It was later found that he was in jail on another charge when the murders occurred. Fortunately for him, I guess. Okay, so this is how fair treatment can be jeopardized through these different things. Desire to please the person in authority, like Joey, watching for the clues. I don't know what the question really means, but does he want a yes answer or a no answer? I don't understand abstract concepts like waiving my rights. Memory gaps, can't assist in their own defense. Too pleasant or sassy facade, like Joey for sure. Bluffing greater confidence, I was a drug runner. And quickness to take blame, particularly for their friends. And then breakdown of defenses. Well, if I just admit to it, they'll let me go home. All right, so then this, as a result of the first study, we received funding to work with plea community services to do assessments, increase awareness, and so on, and integrate services through case planning and family support. So I'm going to give you some data from this first group, but we've probably seen, I'm sure it's over 100, because it's been an ongoing program. So these are the screening items in order to get into the program. And this screening was done by the probation officer. So we call them at first environmental factors or social factors, being adopted or being in foster care or involved in child protective services. Well, children these days are often adopted or in foster care because their parents are unable to care for them, and often the reason is because of alcohol and drug abuse. We may know that there's prenatal alcohol use, or at least that the mother has an alcohol problem. Now, to make the diagnosis, it has to be confirmed for the pregnancy. But for screening, if you know that that's there, then it passes the screening item. Or if the youth has a sibling with an FASD diagnosis. Now these things here, these are the youth factors. And you would say, well, they look so broad. That must apply to everybody. That's what someone said to us. But they don't apply to everybody. Developmental delay, learning, growth, mental health diagnoses, ADHD diagnoses. And we had birth defects in there at first, but that didn't actually bring anybody in. Because if you think about it, these factors reflect underlying problems that we've already talked about. So the learning difficulties can be reflective of poor memory and poor language and so on. Developmental delay, certainly the language delay. Mental health diagnoses and the ADHD, which are so common. So to get past the screening, you had to have one or more environmental plus 2 personal, or none of the environmental and 3 personal. And then the probation officers got consent. So in this first group, this is what they look like. And the important thing that I do want to emphasize, it looks heavily with Aboriginal students, but that's just the bias of the referral, because we had one probation officer in Vancouver whose job was, first of all, he had Aboriginal youth, he was Aboriginal himself, youth on his caseload, and also he had a real interest in FAS. So he was more likely to refer people than other probation officers who just didn't bother. So that's why the numbers look like that, but in general, it's the other way around. And so, for the 43 youth that received a complete diagnosis, 37 received this assessment, 37 received the diagnosis. So that's well over 80%. So the screening was working in identifying the ones that were ending up with the diagnosis. So when we look at brain dysfunction, we're trying to look at aspects of performance that are relating to the underlying brain structure or function and not relating to postnatal environmental experiences. So using our tests and interviews, for each one of our measures, which you'll see in a minute, we either rate it as 0, we just don't have information, can't judge it. Individual is normal, they show mild problems, or significant. And this is where the conservative part comes in. That means we're in the bottom 3 to be significant. So yes, there might be people that are alcohol affected that are kind of low average, but we're not going to make a diagnosis unless it's significant. And so in order to make the ARND or FASD diagnosis, you have to have at least 3 domains with significant dysfunction. And these are the domains, these are the areas that are actually tested, but the alarm captures most of those. And so, pretty much normal in some of these areas, significant for cognition, communication, and all these areas. And the important thing here was that even though you only needed 3 in order to make the diagnosis, the average was over 5. So they're showing multiple areas, but at the same time showing strengths as well. So for example, within the cognition, the IQ, maybe they're showing a low verbal, but maybe their visual skills are really high. And that still is important. Communication or memory, maybe their visual memory is just fine. But if their verbal memory or their working memory is poor, then that's a memory deficit. So even within these profiles, there is a lot of up and down, which masks the underlying problem. So when they're all put together, a couple of them had growth problems. This is for making the diagnosis. You look for growth. No one had moderate or even severe facial features. They were all mild or none. And then it was all of this. So the definite brain dysfunction relates to maybe they had a small head size. So these are the ARND individuals, 37 of them, with essentially no physical findings, but only the brain difficulties. And these are some of the additional behaviors that characterize them. The main ones, you can see, you can relate to these, but easily manipulated and led by others was a big one. But here's no understanding of personal boundaries, and you can see all these things. Anger control problem, disinhibited about sharing personal information, that's important. 100% poor decision maker, I guess it kind of goes without saying, and lack of insight. And then the misuse of alcohol and other drugs was very high as well. So they all had, many of these, but those 3 were probably the most important ones. 13 minutes. Thank you. Can I have 20? Okay. Okay, well, anyway, I'm going to skip over this a little bit because, this is important. So the probation officers had the opportunity to say, okay, what about your youth? Because we did a survey, it makes you think he does have FAS. What about your youth? Makes you think he doesn't have FAS. So we looked at all those things. But here are some things he may not have FAS, and these are misunderstandings. And this we think is important. So essentially the probation officers were saying, okay, well he doesn't have FAS because he has no physical features. Well now you know, mainly people don't have physical features. Or conduct disorder and ADHD is the problem. Well, but he has FASD too. How about he has another disorder? Well, you can have multiple disorders. But this is the one that I think is so important for any of you working in the legal system, which was, I don't think he has FASD because he's had these previous psychiatric assessments and they didn't say anything about FAS. So that doesn't mean he doesn't have it, but it means that they maybe didn't look for it or they didn't know how to assess it. But people think that because they've had all of these comprehensive assessments, well, if he had FASD, someone would have mentioned it by now. So you always have to look and see, did they look for it and did they find it? Okay, so we have those broad-based indicators that if you have, and if they have the alcohol history confirmed before they come in for the assessment, it identifies them really well. And if you want more information on the screening, this little book, it's at the table and the other place, or you can get it online. Yes, on this. All right, so with the time that we have left, this is something that I think has become important, and again, looking at that whole picture of what happens in childhood. And some of these things, can we prevent them as a community? I hope we can begin preventing them. But the ACE study was not done in FAS. It was done in the US, and it was done as 17,000 adults. First of all, that belonged to one of these big health providers in the States, and they did these lengthy interviews, and they found out with these 17,000 people some patterns of adverse childhood experiences. And their model here suggests that you start out with these adverse childhood experiences, and these things happen, you adopt high-risk behaviors, and then oftentimes it's leading to early death. I'll just skip, this is just the details, so if you can look it up. If you go on the Centers for Disease Control in the US, they have all of these references. But they compiled from like 27 pages of interview data into these categories. And it does make sense in terms of adverse experiences. You can see some of them have to do with abuse, a household member who's incarcerated, some mental health, mother treated violently, and so on. But what isn't addressed is what happens generation after generation. And this is something that we become increasingly interested in, about how to break a cycle that expands beyond the adverse experiences of this one child. It goes back generations. But what turned out to be important, so in the number 4 adverse conditions, again this broad normal population, is that once you have 4 of those things, it increases these health risks and mental health risks, these risky behaviors, and even physical inactivity and severe obesity, correlated with 4 or more of those indicators. And in adolescence, starting to smoke early, sexual activity, drug use, and these things. So the more ACEs you have, the more likely some of these other adverse events are going to happen. And this is the thing that I think is so surprising. It's correlated in later adulthood with these physical problems. So these adverse childhood experiences correlated with cancers, lung disease, heart disease, and so on. Okay, so we looked at those same 37 youth. So the big study was adults looking backwards, but we looked at the records of them. And I'll just skip this one, but this is the comparison. So this is really essentially the norm, that people have a lot of these things happening to them, but much more so with our group with FASD. So this is why you really begin to appreciate they have FASD, they have these environmental factors, they have some mental health concerns. They're such a complex group, and this is why we need integrated approaches to working with them, and from an early age, identifying them and hopefully preventing some of these things from happening. This is in your handout, and you can have another look at it. But what we felt also was that the ratings, like mother treated violently, like it didn't even capture the depth of the problems. Mother treated violently, well, we've had mothers murdered, and all of these sorts of things. So this is what our group looks like. And then currently, again, already the mental health problems, the substance abuse, this is where I think we have to really direct our efforts. If we can prevent the substance abuse in these youth, then I think we have a chance of dealing with some of the other problems. Okay, so the results of the ACE indicated they are at risk for the disabilities relating to high-risk behaviors, mental health, substance abuse at a younger age, and then possibly those health-related problems. So this is the kinds of things through the plea community services that the youth were able to access. So there was intensive support and supervision workers, a lot of workers, but also even providing for their basic needs. Showing the family, this is a family thing, showing the mom how to find the food bank when she moves into the new community. And one worker rallying his co-workers to come up with some furniture for the place that she was moving into. The curfew monitoring, this is alcohol and drug, and this was another program that they offered. So you realize that to really support this youth, you have to take a family approach, and it's really a holistic approach. The barriers include staff turnover, loss of services when they turn 19, homelessness, and mental health professionals who are unaware of the disabilities. So again, this is where we have to continue to do more education. The benefits of the diagnosis, hopefully access to services, fair treatment, that it isn't poor parenting, but these problems stemmed from what happened in utero, and it isn't the fault of anybody. And maybe we can prevent these secondary disabilities. The diagnosis helps the individual to understand himself. We find this very beneficial. It can reduce the next generation from being born with FASD, that we know more about what are the needs of the adults, because there is that concern now where there are more programs being put in place for adults. And the assessment provides a profile to help direct plans, and regardless of the diagnosis, even if they don't get an FASD diagnosis, they have that profile. So I want to thank you for being here today, and I want to thank my teams. There still might be a couple questions.
Might have time for a question.
Is there funding available for a person over 19 or at that sort of that cutoff age for them to get assessment at the Asante Center?
Well, they could come at any age. Whether there is funding available through one of the programs is the issue. But for the youth, some of them have been actually a little bit older who have come through the youth justice program, because if they had a probation officer, say when they were 18, and they're still on probation, or if they initiated the process, then we could possibly do that assessment.
But if they didn't come through the justice system, is there?
Oh, well, then there's a fee for that,
Oh,
unfortunately. Yeah, so we don't right now have funding, but hopefully that's going to happen in the future. People are talking about the need for adult diagnosis. Great deal. Yeah.
I just want to say a lot of the problems that we see in our communities is that the frontline workers, specifically the RCMP, are not trained, do not have the education, they're not even mentioned in there as being a big part of the problem for our youth and for our adults that become in it. And we end up, as they become into our systems, being in mental health, we are advocating for those youth, for those adults that are still 8 years old, say, and where they just don't get it, like the RCMP, and that they have inappropriate, like they're laughing, or some of them, they don't get it, and they think it's so frustrating for us, and we know that they have FASD. We know that the families drink, we know that the mothers drank, and now they're over the age. But still, we get hassled, and the lawyers, and they try their best to advocate as well as we do. And that's the problem in our smaller communities. How do we get, that's a big agency that needs training.
There was a special training program for RCMP, and they started delivering the program, and I don't know what happened. This is a few years ago. So
Your life got a whole lot easier than
Yeah.
ours, and the lawyers.
all right. Well, this is a project for your community.
Yeah.
Take on it. Yeah, we'll do another legal day and justice day.
For sure.
Yeah, but I understand the problem.
It's
It's
really
frustrating.
frustrating, especially me.
Yeah. But I think we're doing a better job.
We are.
Is it getting better?
Yeah, it's getting better. Does things get better? I hope so.
On behalf of the Bulkley Valley FASD Committee, I'd like to thank you, Conry, and present you with those gifts.
Thank you very much.
for presenting.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.